Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I'm Parikshit Luthra. These are the top global headlines we are tracking. US President Trump says he is disappointed but not done with Russia's President Putin. This comes hours after Trump announced plans to send more weapons to Ukraine and threatened Russia with 100% tariffs if the war does not end in 50 days. The process to appoint the next Federal Reserve chair has begun, says U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. U.S. inflation picks up pace in June to 2.7% as companies pass on the tariff increase to consumers. British Civil Aviation Authority says it has no technical concerns with Boeing planes, clarifies to CNBC-TV18 on the safety notice over fuel walls was issued in 2015, says it does not require any additional actions from UK carriers. After years of speculation, back and forth and deliberations, Elon Musk's Tesla has officially entered India. The EV maker opened its first India showroom in Mumbai's Bandra Kurla complex. The EV giant has two variants of the Model Y on display at its 4,000 square feet showroom. The Model Y will be available at a starting price of 60 lakh rupees, which includes import duties and tariffs. The cars have been imported from Tesla's Shanghai factory. On to the day's global market action. The Indian market snapped a four-day losing streak. Sensex gained over 300 points and the Nifty gained over 100 points. Hong Kong's Hang Seng led the rally, gaining 1.6%, while Japan's Nikkei and South Korea's Kospi added 0.5% each. Meanwhile, Wall Street is painting a mixed picture in early trade. Nvidia shares are rallying after Trump administration allowed sale of high-end chips to China. What's also moving the market is inflation, accelerating to 2.7% in June as companies in the US pass on the cost of tariffs to consumers. Our top focus this evening, US President Donald Trump has said he is disappointed but not done with Russia's President Putin. This comes hours after Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Russia unless it agrees to end the war with Ukraine within 50 days. That's not all. He also threatened secondary tariffs of the same amount on countries trading with Russia. This essentially means that any country that trades with Russia will face the tax if they want to sell their products to the USA. Speaking alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House, Trump said that he was very unhappy with Russia's lack of progress towards a peace deal, adding that a deal should have been made 2 months ago. Meanwhile, Russia's deputy foreign minister said that Moscow was ready to negotiate but warned that Russia did not warm to ultimatums. The Kremlin has not formally responded to the 50-day deadline just yet. Trump has previously floated the idea of secondary sanctions targeting countries that continue doing business with Russia. This in a bid to isolate Moscow from global trade networks. Trump said, and I quote, "We've been very successful in settling wars with trade." End of quote. He even cited examples of India, Pakistan and Rwanda, Congo as examples. Trump has also confirmed a major NATO weapons deal to support Ukraine, including shipments of US-made Patriot missile systems. He said billions of dollars worth of military equipment would be purchased by NATO allies from the US and quickly distributed to the battlefield. Joining me now to discuss this further is Rachel Rizzo, Atlantic Council Europe Center. She's a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Rachel. Do you think Trump, by making that statement against Putin, saying that I'm very disappointed, we could impose severe tariffs if you don't agree to a deal, this shows Trump's frustration?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us who watch these issues pretty closely have been wondering for quite some time now when Trump would reach a point where he's so frustrated with Vladimir Putin because there seems to be no progress being made on this potential ceasefire, which Trump actually made a mainstay of his campaign. And finally, I think we've reached that point. And what this looks like, I mean, obviously, you had the announcement yesterday next to the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House. You also had this announcement about potential 100% secondary tariffs if a ceasefire deal isn't reached within 50 days. So you can really see this frustration with Putin bubbling up to the surface. And so the support for Ukraine is more based in that rather than being based in a desire to fully support Ukraine, I think.
Right. Rachel, the Russian spokesperson has gone on to say that they take Trump's threat very seriously. They're going to analyze what Washington has said. What really are Donald Trump's options if Russia were not to agree? And would Putin even be bothered about 100% tariffs?
Well, this is really the question here. All right. So the US has negligible imports from Russia. Okay. It's about 0.2% of US imports. So the real question here is whether or not the United States, Trump specifically, because this is where these policies lie, would be willing to follow through on these threats to impose 100% secondary tariffs on countries that continue to trade with Russia. So this would hit countries like India pretty hard because Russia accounts for 40% of, for example, India's crude oil imports. This would hit China pretty hard as well. And Trump hasn't wanted to do this thus far because I think he's wanted to give Vladimir Putin a chance to come to the table himself. But at this point, it's being very clear that that's not something he'll do. And so really, Trump has to decide whether and when he wants to tighten these levers. I think it really also depends on this weapons shipment deal with NATO in Ukraine and whether or not those weapons deliveries can turn the tide of the war. So taken together, this is a much broader picture than I think was painted yesterday at the White House. And we have to see how things play out over the next 50 days. But certainly last night, Russia continued its barrage of attacks on Ukraine with 267 drones. So certainly the announcement was made yesterday and nothing has changed thus far.
How significant is the latest defense package and support, military support to Ukraine?
I think it's hugely significant. I mean, one of the issues, I think, with the first few months of the Trump administration, and even during his campaign, as I said before, is he's made it very clear that he wants the Europeans to shoulder the most of the burden for continuing to support Ukraine. During Trump's campaign, he said over and over again that the United States has been sending all these weapons, that we've been spending all this money. And when you compare that to what the Europeans have been doing, it's been far more. Now, that's not a full picture. The Europeans have been doing a lot, and they have been really stepping up to the plate in terms of defense spending and supporting Ukraine. But the U.S. has really taken a back seat now, hoping that the Europeans can shoulder the majority, like the lion's share of the burden. And so with this weapons shipment deal announced yesterday, it does, I think, sort of signify this changing tide, this about face that the Trump administration seems to be doing in terms of its support for Ukraine. But again, as I said before, this is rooted in frustration with Putin rather than affection for Zelensky or affection for Ukraine.
Now, considering that 2 rounds of talks between Russia and Ukraine have happened in Istanbul and a 3rd round will take place, and Russia has said that they are ready for further talks with Ukraine, but they've not received any proposal for now. Do you think Putin can be trusted over the next 50 days? Is there enough pressure on them to come to a deal? Because they have larger ambitions. They want to emerge victorious from this. They would like the deal to happen on their terms. So do you expect Putin and Russia to only buy time and probably get an extension for another 50 days? Or do you think this is possibly the time when Putin will come to the table and get a deal done?
Well, I mean, I think it really depends. If Putin is in a place, if Russia is in a place at some point where they realize that they've reached the end of the line, okay, there's no ability to go any further in terms of gaining more Ukrainian territory, then their possibility that they'll come to the table, I think, goes up. But up until now, I think Putin has shown no real willingness to negotiate, no real willingness to end this war. And of course, he can't walk away from this war having it look like a loss. This has to have looked like a win for him. But it also has to have had to look like a win for Zelensky and Trump as well. I think Trump has gotten to a point where when he's speaking to reporters, you really sense this frustration with Putin's unwillingness to negotiate. You know, Trump has said, we have these great conversations on the phone. They last for a couple hours. And then he hangs up and bombs people in Ukraine at night. So he's really not serious about these negotiations thus far, of course, because the pressure hasn't been put on him high enough. So the question is, what will Trump do? Will Putin come to the table over 50 days, or will he just try to take incremental steps to see if he can lengthen that 50-day timeline?
Right. And Rachel, finally, Trump has threatened 500% tariffs on countries like India and China, which are buying Russian products, including Russian energy. What is the likelihood of the Senate passing the Sanctioning Russia Bill 2025? And will Trump follow through on his threat against countries like India and China?
Okay, so I think it's important to notice that the 100% secondary tariffs that Trump has been talking about is separate from this 500% secondary tariff bill that is going through the Senate and House right now. So you have this bill that is supported by 82 senators. This is broad bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for imposing 500% secondary sanctions on countries that import Russian energy. But it also has this mechanism where the final ability for enforcement comes down to whether or not Trump wants to enforce it. So as of now, if that bill passes, which I'm not sure it will because it's facing some hurdles in the House, I'm not sure if that's something that Trump will actually enforce. What he might rather do is go on, his own discussions with Putin, his own announcement yesterday, and potentially impose his own 100% secondary tariff. So these are two separate issues here, two separate lines of potential punitive measures, both significant, but both ultimately lying in the decision for Donald Trump. And so we have to wait and see, I think, what happens over the next 50 days if Putin wants to come to the table. Right. But I don't think we'll know before then.
Okay, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us with that comprehensive perspective on Trump's threat to Putin and what will happen over the next 50 days.
Absolutely, thanks.
Let's move on to all the other stories from around the world. Tech giant NVIDIA has announced that the Trump administration has granted approval to sell its advanced H20 AI chips to Chinese buyers. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has said that he hopes the company will resume these sales to China soon. This announcement came after company CEO and US President Donald Trump met last week. Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar met Chinese President Xi Jinping during his two-day visit to China. In a post on X, Jaishankar said that he apprised the Chinese president about the normalization of bilateral ties between the two nations. This is the minister's first to China since tensions sprung up due to the Galwan Valley clash along the line of actual control in 2020. The execution of nurse Nimisha Priya has been postponed by the Yemen authorities. Remember, the execution was scheduled for tomorrow. The government of India has been rendering all possible assistance in the matter. It has been making concerted efforts in the recent days to seek more time for Nimisha Priya's family to reach a mutually agreeable solution with the other party. Google has announced a $25 billion investment in data centers and AI infrastructure across US states powered by America's largest electric grid. The tech giant will also spend $3 billion on 2 hydropower deals to support the expansion. JP Morgan Chase posted a strong set of numbers in the second quarter, beating Wall Street expectations. Revenue stood at $45.6 billion, while earnings per share stood at $5.2. Trading revenue jumped 15% as President Donald Trump roiled markets with his push to overhaul global trade agreements. Time for a short break, but don't go anywhere. The European Union warns of countermeasures after US President Trump threatens 30% tariffs on the bloc. We discussed the implications with Jacob Kirkegaard of economic think tank Bruegel. Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens. US President Donald Trump intensified the trade war last week by threatening to impose 30% tariffs on imports from the European Union from the 1st of August. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the EU is prepared to take the necessary steps to safeguard its interests. However, the bloc delayed its retaliatory tariffs on US exports, which are set to come into effect this week, putting tariffs of $100 billion on standby. EU Trade Chief Maros Sefcovic warned that EU's trade with US could be effectively wiped out if Trump follows through on his threat. His comments came as EU trade ministers met in Brussels for urgent talks on how to respond to the US. But why are the trade ties between the two significant? US and European Union have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship in the world. Together, they represent almost 30% of global trade in goods and services and 43% of global GDP. In 2024 alone, the value of trade amounted to $1.9 trillion. The total goods trade between EU and US rose to more than $1 trillion, nearly doubling in value in 10 years. Meanwhile, the bloc's total trade surplus with the US stood at $58 billion in 2024. That's less than 3% of total bilateral trade. To delve further into the trade ties between the US and European Union, joining me now on the program is economist Jacob Kirkegaard, who's also a senior fellow at Bruegel, which is a European think tank. Thank you very much, Jacob, for joining us. What are EU's options really at this stage?
Well, I have to admit, I think they're quite bleak. The reality is that the EU tried very, very hard to find a deal and to basically avoid the original 20% tariffs that Trump announced on April 2nd. They say that they were close to negotiating a deal with USTR and Commerce Secretary Lutnick, but also that this deal, when it came to the White House and was presented to Donald Trump, basically was dismissed. Rather, of course, as we know, Donald Trump issued the EU with a threat of 30% tariffs, meaning 10% more than what the EU was originally threatened with on April 2nd, basically leaving the EU with a clear impression that their attempt to negotiate a deal was viewed as weakness by Donald Trump. And he simply is trying to press the advantage and give them an even harder deal. So what this means is, since I consider it very, very unlikely that Donald Trump is going to sort of dial down his tariffs threats, he's only done that twice so far, against Canada and against China, of course. In both cases, when he was threatened with severe economic consequences for the US own economy. That's not the case yet. But I think the reality is the EU probably has no alternative than to retaliate.
Right. And if Donald Trump were to follow through on his threat of 35% tariffs, what will that do to the European economy, inflation, growth, and exports, considering they are the largest trading partners in the world?
Well, there's no doubt that this will hurt the European economy. I think, depending on how you model it, but I think a good estimate is probably that European growth would drop by 0.5 percentage point of GDP in 2025 and 2026. That's about half, meaning that it will be cut from about 1% to about 0.5 percentage point for this year. So no, this is a significant impact. But at the same time, I think we should also be clear, it's not the end of the world for the European Union. What it would mean is that a number of European businesses would undoubtedly receive various types of state aid. We would see the European Central Bank probably cut rates a little more, probably down to about 1.5 percentage points during the course of the second half of 2025. So it would hurt, but it would not, in my opinion, tilt the EU economy into recession, nor would it amount to the type of existential threat to Europe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine amounts to. And it certainly wouldn't prevent the EU from continuing to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries around the world, including, of course, India.
Right. The other question that I would like to ask you, considering that EU and US are so closely linked together, and the largest EU trade is with the United States, how easy will it or difficult would it be for Europe, for EU to diversify that trading relationship and increase trade with other nations?
Oh, it would be quite difficult. As you mentioned, the US is a very large economy, obviously, and the existing relationship is very, very close. It would not, however, be impossible, but it would certainly require that the EU strike a lot of new free trade agreements. They've just done one with Latin America, or the Mercosur group. They're obviously negotiating with India, the Indian government at the moment. Over the weekend, we heard that political agreement was struck with Indonesia. But we also know that these types of trade agreements take typically, even when they are agreed, a number of years to be fully phased in. And what this means is that even with free trade agreements in place, it would take potentially quite a long time for the EU to achieve the same degree of free trade that it has enjoyed with the United States until the Trump tariffs. So this is certainly a medium and long-term strategy to gradually diversify away from the US economy as a trading partner. And as I said, in the near term, certainly the next year or two, a potential trade war between the EU and the United States would hurt the European economy, to the tune of maybe half a percentage point of GDP growth.
Right. Does the EU have the potential to give in to the kind of compromise that Donald Trump is asking? Could you list out some of the measures that Donald Trump is seeking?
Well, I think one of the problems that the EU is facing is that, the EU doesn't really know what Donald Trump actually wants, other than he wants more tariffs. The EU were negotiating with USTR and the Commerce Department to try to come up with some sort of deal that could, keep tariffs maybe at the 10%, maybe even exempt some goods categories such as airlines and other categories. Maybe in return, the EU would commit to purchasing additional US LNG. Maybe also, as your previous guest talked about, maybe the European Union would buy more US weapons for transfers for Ukraine. So there were a number of things that the EU were trying to placate Donald Trump with. What the EU will not do is to change EU regulation on food security, auto safety standards, value-added tax levels, and some of these other alleged non-tariff barriers that Donald Trump has expressed his dissatisfaction with. And certainly what the EU will not accept is, a starting point of 30% tariffs.
Right.
The reality is that the EU and the US are economies that certainly in trading terms are roughly the same. And with two such economies, typically tariffs will go up together and then maybe in the future come down together again. But as I said, fundamentally, it's unclear what Donald Trump actually wants from this relationship other than more tariffs.
Right. Do you feel that this ongoing and continuous trade uncertainty with the United States may make the EU try and have a deal faster with India?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. This is, as I said earlier, this is a medium to long-term strategy from the EU to diversify away from, dependence on the United States. It's also, of course, a long-standing goal of the EU to promote, global free trade. And I think the EU also wants to, by negotiating with India, they want to set an example that actually, irrespective of the kind of, WTO non-compliant actions that we see almost on a daily basis from the Trump administration, countries can actually continue to, trade and liberalize their trade based on a predictable rules-based process, which is what the EU and India are trying to achieve.
Right. Jacob Kirkegaard, thank you very much for joining us. Definitely very uncertain times. We're also facing a lot of trade uncertainty here in India. Hopefully, there will be some clarity on the trade deal between India and the United States as well, and India and European Union too. Let's move on. And before we wrap, Indian astronaut Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla has returned from the International Space Station along with 3 other astronauts of the Axiom 4 mission. The SpaceX Dragon spacecraft splashed down off the coast of California at 3 p.m. India time today. Astronaut Shubhanshu Shukla is the first Indian to visit the International Space Station and spent 18 days at their space station. He will now undergo a 7-day rehabilitation program. We leave you with visuals. Thank you for watching and goodbye.